Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Zmuda, and welcome to our next series of LinkedIn Live conversations with the American School of the Hague. And we are so pleased that Kili is joining us with a collection of her classroom teachers that have really started to begin to make sense and do their early drafts of curriculum storyboarding. So Kili, welcome to the party.
Thanks. It's really great to be here.
Fantastic. So as we continue to move through this conversation, I love that we have multiple voices at the table. So as we start doing our initial conversations and reflections, if each one of you can introduce yourselves as part of that connection. So Kili, let's start with you. If you can start to clarify quickly, what's your job description? And then lean directly into one of the most important questions at that level of the organization. What were some of the persistent problems that Curriculum Storyboards was an answer for?
Yeah, great. So hi, I'm Kili, and I am the Director of Curriculum and Staff Development at American School of the Hague. And one of the things, well, it was actually a confluence of a number of persistent problems, but the documentation of the school's written curriculum was probably the biggest problem that I was trying to solve. But I also wanted to tie that in with a relatively new vision that the school set forth several years ago, and we are still kind of working through some implementation with COVID delays and so forth. So kind of coming back to our vision of creating the conditions where all learners are able and confident to take control of their own learning. And to us, that really speaks to putting students in a more active role of the learning process and in the learning journey. And so I was grappling with a couple of things. One, curriculum documentation, but also are there ways, or how might you go about doing that in a way that also speaks to our vision and bringing learners more actively into that central role. And then coupled with it, we had some technical platform changes happening at our school, and maybe other school leaders and teachers will recognize that is a perennial issue in schools, that platforms change a lot, and it puts takes a lot of bandwidth to kind of rejig and reconfigure how we do things. So I was looking for ways that might then build into existing ways of working that would lower the barrier to get things started. And that's when I came across the article in the Ed Leadership magazine from ASCD that, Allison, you were the co-author with Heidi Hayes-Jacobs. I read that article, and as I was reading it, every part of it got me a little bit more excited about the possibilities. It was super appealing, and it connected with the power of story. I think is something we all can connect to. And so almost immediately that seemed like the answer to a lot of the questions that I was grappling with. And so that's that point that I dove into the world of curriculum storyboarding, which was very new for me at that point. But I learned there's a lot of resources that I jumped into. So that was kind of the starting point for me.
Absolutely. And for folks that are joining us live, you very much can add in some comments or questions. So if you want to go ahead and put that in the chat, we're more than welcome to engage you in the conversation. So I will pose those questions to Kili and her team as we continue throughout this hour. So Kili, as I started to jot and take some notes down in terms of the reflections that you are starting to clarify in terms of the persistent problems, there are two pretty consistent areas that I think many, not only leaders can relate to, but classroom teachers. And I'd love to see a little more from the perspective of your team. So I think one thing that I took note on is having students have more of an active role in the journey and taking control of themselves as they're moving through the experience. So I didn't know if Michelle, Angie, Corey, or Gary want to speak to that. What have you been seeing? Again, you started to tie it back to COVID and post-COVID. What have you seen in your own students in terms of their level of engagement that also made this appealing enough so that you took a shot at developing this?
I'm not sure exactly how to answer that. I would say that getting students more involved definitely gives them a chance to take more ownership and take more interest in what they're doing. The storyboard gives kind of a perspective that allows that, but I feel like I'm just kind of in the infancy stage of it and haven't really made it an integral part of what I'm doing yet.
So, Corey, what I'm hearing you say is that when you're drafting a curriculum storyboard, because you're already intimately aware that it's written for the students, the opportunity of starting to think about in what ways can we preview that experience for students so that they're likely to not only see the territory of what they're about to experience, but have some level of navigation or clarity as to the journey you're taking them on. So
sure.
That's right. And again, it's also something that's really exciting because as you started to do it, and again, Kili started with the article. I know, Kili, you spent some time on a webinar or two. You started to look at some YouTube videos such as this that continue to help people in the infancy to start their journey. Are there areas, Kili and potentially the team, that you really gravitated to? Were there some early pieces of wisdom, whether it was myself or Heidi or other folks that started this process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I was really unaware of the really active storyboarding community that exists. And I think seeing examples from other schools was the first thing that helped me see how really easy it would be. Nothing like this is easy, but it was not a huge barrier to imagine what it could look like. And I think the teachers that are here with me today can shed some light on those early steps with it, because I from those published articles and the webinars, you kind of get a sense of what's possible with this. It isn't as constricting as some of our other curriculum templates have felt, where when we've started with some curriculum documentation for new courses, which is how we started with Corey and Angie in the math department. And I can share a little bit about what was different for Michelle and Gary, who are sort of curious adventurers doing a self-paced rollout of it on their own. But with Corey and Angie in the math department, we were really looking at it as a way to document new courses. So there were changes. So we needed to go in and think about what was really appealing about the storyboard was what's the journey of the student for the year, rather than how sometimes it can go about thinking unit by unit or lesson by lesson, or where they need to be in 2 years' time or 4 years' time. But really think about in that year that we have students that we're now, most of our way, not most of our way, we still have a quarter to go, but we're a good way through that year of those courses that we developed about a year ago in May 23. To think about that experience from the beginning to the end through the eyes of a student. And that to me was really powerful. So thinking about it in terms of images and a summary, so that it isn't really bogged down in heavy documentation. You didn't have to I mean, you had to be able to get to the gist of what the unit was about, but I think that's what was refreshing and energizing. And I think the conversations that we had a year ago, and I'm thinking back, Angie and Corey, to those 2 days we had in the math wing, those conversations were really, really interesting. And they were, thinking about how we might put the content together in a way that's appealing to students and in a way that they'll understand as they move. But of course, this has to happen first, but then this, and then how Corey brings a story to life might be different than how another teacher brings it to life. But yet it is from the inception thinking about that journey of the student.
Now, Kili, before we turn it over to Corey and Angie to walk us through their initial design approach, we have a question from Michelle on LinkedIn. Have students been part of the drafting the storyboards, or it has been primarily teachers at this point?
Yeah, I love that question. And right now it has been largely the teachers, and it's taken two different strategies. One strategy was really guided and directed as part of like curriculum review, as part of supporting the development of new courses. But then there's been another strategy, which was the one that Michelle, Monroe, and Gary on the call have taken, which was I put forward an explanation and a pathway on how teachers could go about this on their own without really face-to-face guidance and more of a, follow at your own kind of self-paced course. And they're two great examples of teachers who were finding the right moment, the right opportunity, the energy, the enthusiasm, and they've developed also some really exciting storyboards for courses that they teach in middle school.
Nice. So again, as we continue the conversation, please go ahead and drop a question or two in the chat and we'll work it into the conversation. So let's open up an example of a curriculum storyboard. So if we can start with one of the math examples to put on the screen, and then let's start talking it through. All right. So who's the proud owner of this particular 10th grade integrated math?
Okay, so they're going to love me for this. Neither of them are currently teaching it, but Angie, this is the one that I was thinking since we were developing it last year that you might have some insights to share about how we put it together, how we designed it, how we drafted it, because you were our main contact. We're also developing some courses for teachers who work with us. So I don't know, maybe in international schools, that's a reality that faces us almost every spring, that we have changes coming about that we need to carry forward with while undergoing transition. So maybe Angie, I don't know if you feel like this is something you could speak to a bit, how we put it together or what the design process was.
Yeah, like you said, this isn't one that I actually created. But I think I can talk about our process as a team because we did spend time all working together. And this development came as we were, switching transition. So we were going from courses that were the Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, and switching to an integrated program. So a lot of the initial work is sort of looking at where the commonalities are. Like a lot of it's not starting everything over, it's like kind of reorganizing how things are structured. So initially it's like looking at what are the topics in the units and the areas of study that we currently exist, and then where do they live as we start transitioning to this other kind of flow for the curriculum. So I guess having this storyboard way was kind of nice because you could almost kind of puzzle piece it together. We currently have these like 6 units throughout the Algebra 1 year, so where does that live in our kind of new pathway? And So I think that made it kind of easy. And I think also looking at, I think Kili talked about too, kind of the transition piece. I think it was a good amount of information without tying teachers down, especially in a transition, because where we want to be in a few years after students have worked their way through is going to be different than where they are the first year of implementation, because we need to meet students where they are. And kind of having this more upper level of description gives you some flexibility to do what you need to do to meet students where they are, without having to spend all your time in the first year of implementation getting too stuck and bogged down in those details. I don't know, so maybe Corey can add to that a little.
Corey, did you want to add first?
I think Angie pretty much covered it. I mean, these were our initial thoughts kind of as we were thinking what we're going to go on these courses, and some of it I think we've kind of deviated from, and we've gone back and cleaned it up a little bit, but I think the big work is going to come now that we've taught this course. How does this change? What did we actually get done? What do we think, are there things we want to move to other courses? So it'll be a work in progress, I think, forever.
So, I mean, I think that's one of the joys and the terrors of curriculum writing, in that you continue to step back and think about it a little bit anew. But at the same time, one of the things that I appreciate that Angie and Corey with Kili did is started to lay out, when you have like some kind of curriculum review or course change, it's really helpful to have this kind of bird's eye view and begin to think about what's the flow of the entire year. So I think that's important to stress for those people that are brand new to Curriculum Storyboards, that this kind of course view is that opportunity to look down the road and think about what are the unit territories or titles. So you can see in integrated math that you see circles as unit 3, descriptive statistics as unit 4. So laying out those major topics. The second piece is really starting to think about the focus of the story and clarifying the areas that are most essential, not necessarily to cover, that's from a teacher perspective, but from a student's perspective, what is it that they're going to explore, to investigate, to create? If we can go to the next page of this one, for example. So when we're starting to think about the focus of the story, they also should be directly tied or connected to the learning targets. The focus of the story is starting to go after these kinds of bigger explorations and ideas, but the learning goals or targets actually ground them into concrete, actionable goals that students can also predict and track their performance on. So that to me is the dance between the focus of the story, which is designed for active engagement, with the learning goals, which is paired for more of a concrete flow of what students can expect, not only on their journey, but the kinds of things they'll be assessed on. So hopefully that's clarifying for people that are just joining the audience now and are starting to get their arms around what a curriculum storyboard is. So if we could go back to the previous page, I'd like to hear a little bit about the initial design before we flip to Michelle and Gary on the images and what those were like for you in terms of starting to figure out how to best visually represent that. So what was your design process finding those?
I don't know if I thought too much about it. It was just more, what is one big idea from the unit that could be represented visually? So, triangles, how do we apply right triangle trigonometry to find things out? So, a typical kind of problem would be trying to measure the height of something that I can't measure directly, hence that, or modeling with quadratics, like a ball would fly in an arc.
Yeah.
So those are kind of like problems students will encounter during the course of that unit.
I think the statistics thing we might have grabbed from the New York Times, what's going on in this graph.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, what you're also trying to do, Corey and Angie, especially in that visual communication, you're trying to capture a moment that gives an insight into the types of problems and challenges that are not just happening in your particular integrated math classroom, but also are directly relevant, as the two of you just said, to the outside world. So grabbing something from the New York Times, grabbing something based on what Angie described, measuring something that you can't necessarily see or quantify without that understanding of right triangles and trigonometry. Those are the opportunities of making math applicable and real, especially to high school students that continuously ask, when do we have to ever use this? So, all right, so let's flip, if we can, to Michelle and Gary and talk a little bit about your initial design process.
For us, it was a little bit different. Because as Kili mentioned earlier, she had been working closely with Angie and Gary in the math department, but for us, she'd sent it out via email, and I read about what the math department had done, and I'd seen the exemplars that were just up on the screen, and I was like, wow, that's really cool, and it's quite different from the previous tool we were using to map curriculum, which was Atlas Rubicon, which is a little bit more clunky and not as sleek and user-friendly as the storyboards. And so I decided to give it a go. And the timing just happened to be fortuitous because I was planning a new course. And in the middle school here, we were transitioning to some different electives for students and giving them a little bit more choice in what they wanted to learn. And so I teach home economics traditionally, and I was focusing in on a new baking course. And so this course was going to be preparation for my high school food science class. And that's kind of how all of the planets aligned to get my storyboard going.
So Michelle, let's pull up your home economics storyboard. I think we have that. Fantastic. Yeah. The great cookie keeper. Is that right?
Yeah, that's it.
So, and if you can go to the next page, let's just get a sense of what this storyboard looks like. So talk us through whether you, I don't know if you started with the titles or you started with the images or the focus of the story. Just walk us through your process.
Well, I actually started with the learning goals. I thought, what do I want this course to become? I only have a semester with the students, so 18 weeks flies right by. And I thought, at the end of this semester, what do I want students to have a foundational knowledge in? And once I had that done, I said, okay, now they're going to know all of these things. So what are the essential questions? How am I going to lead them to these goals and get their mental juices flowing so they really start thinking about what we're doing in the class and why and how? Once I had those two pieces, then I broke it down into units and gave the units some names and numbers. And that led me into all of the images. And for the images, mine are really simple, black and white. I got them from the Noun Project. I don't know if anyone knows that website. It's really good for integrating into courses where you have a lot of language learners. If you need to make things visual for your students, it's a really great tool to use. And so that's where all of these images came from. They're free and open source, so they were handy to use for this. And the last thing I did was the focus of the story. Once I knew what I wanted to teach, then I could describe how I was going to teach it.
So thanks for walking us through that process, because every designer that I've been working with over the past year since Curriculum Storyboards came out actually has a little bit of a different process or approach. So thinking about focusing first on the learning targets or the learning goals that you deeply cared about, especially because you are working with them in middle school to get them ready for your own class in high school. Is that correct, Michelle?
Yes.
Yeah. So you're basically trying to get them energized and excited about working with foods. So you're also getting them relatively grounded and prepared to take a more sophisticated course. So you have a vested interest in laying out those basic foundations, but then you started to move to what are the essential questions that sparked, then laid it out into unit titles where perhaps the learning goals were bundled. Then you did the images, and then finally the focus of the story. So that potentially is another good way, especially of starting to imagine a brand new course. And this is a survey course. Would you clarify that as well? Right. It's a survey course of only 18 weeks. So when time is not your friend, curriculum storyboards are also really helpful to get you honed in on what is super important, because sometimes we can't cover everything that's important. And the next part is, how do you get kids to be energized and engaged? And one of the things that I love about this particular example is the friendliness of the language. And so to try to make sure that it's accessible, that it is something that kids can actually read and lean into. So I love that. Okay, Gary, let's talk about your design process next.
So my design process followed fairly similar to what Michelle's did. If you notice, the look of our storyboards is very similar. And, I followed, the UBD model. I think the other piece that I would mention is, as we were reorganizing our middle school elective program, we went from semester-long electives in some cases to quarter-long electives. And so a course of mine that used to be a combined grade 5 and 6 course that ran for a semester now became a 5th grade course and a 6th grade course that built upon one another for 9 weeks each, and then fed into the 2 new electives that, were also created. So the storyboards helped me think about what the sequence of the story was going to look like as a child moved from 5th grade through 8th grade in the design technology world. And I think the thing that I really liked about the whole storyboard piece is that this is one of the first times in, all my years of education that the focus is on helping the students really understand the story of what's going on versus, traditional UBD models and, documents that are housed in Atlas. And so making it more accessible to the students, I think, was really one of the value adds with the storyboard piece. Also, with that sequential piece, it really helped them understand the flow from, 5th grade to 8th grade and what the full story of design technology looks like.
So, Gary, there are a couple things I'd love to unpack. I think the first piece is sort of the connection to understanding by design. Based on your experience, Gary, you started to see that there is a direct connection to UBD. So it's not just the territory of the essential questions, but also starting to think about and focus on what are the goals of learning before you're starting to design that next level of detail. So I just want to emphasize that it does have a direct and meaningful connection to understanding by design. Go ahead.
I think building on that, Allison, is the piece that, some of the elements of the storyboards weren't things that we necessarily had to create from scratch. They were things that existed in, other forms in, yes, documents whose audience was, either teachers or parents or, the school community at large. And so, it made it also seem like, a low floor for, having success with the storyboard itself.
Yeah. And so I think that's another interesting part, Gary, is that if you have had experience with understanding by design, or you have experience in a software platform like Rubicon, many of those pieces potentially can be curated or mined from previous work. So you're not necessarily starting from scratch. I think the second part, Gary, that I wanted to interact with you on is that not only this kind of opportunity to craft a storyboard for grade 6, even though you were working instead of a semester long, this was now a quarter long survey course. Is that right?
Correct.
But Okay, but also really trying to figure out, it's not just like when time is not your friend doing this well, but also starting to think about the progression of what design tech looks like from 5th grade to 8th grade. So when you started to potentially start to lay that out, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade, what were some of the design insights or discoveries that you had along the way so you continue to grow their skills and sophistication?
Right. So I think it helped with understanding what some of the through lines were through 5th through 8th grade and making sure that those were preserved in each of the stories that were being told. You know, one of those through lines is the design thinking process. And then another through line were some of the technical skills that the students were building. And so the storyboarding helped ensure that those, you know, maintained fidelity throughout the middle school experience.
Absolutely. And again, leaning into Unit 2, for example, the morning routine problem with the focus of the story starting out, do you love mornings or is your alarm clock your worst enemy? Either way, your morning can be improved in this kickoff unit. So when you're starting to see that language, it is hyper 6th grade friendly, right? And hopefully as students begin to experience the curriculum storyboard, they're starting to see the value of what it's actually clarifying for them. Also, the learning goals, again, continue to anchor what are the expectations you have as a teacher as they're working through this particular problem or challenge. So, Gary, insights as to your own process. What did you do first? What did you do next?
Yeah, you know, similar to Michelle, I started with what the learning goals were, then went and dialed in the essential questions. From there, thought about what the story would look like for each of the units. You know, one thing that I did to try to make the language really accessible was I leveraged ChatGPT. So I came up with, you know, what some of the parameters were and then asked it to, you know, write this so that an 11-year-old could understand it, and then massage the language from there. So that was, you know, a nice tie-in. And then using the noun project that Michelle had shared with us, you know, that was a great way of, you know, creating icons that were, you know, spot on with the story versus, you know, trying to, you know, locate something.
Okay, thank you so much. And again, one question that is coming in now, it's a question on formative and summative assessments. So when you're starting to think about the crafting, and again, Gary, I'm going to ask you to go first, but then open it up to Michelle, Angie, and Corey. When you're starting to clarify, if you can put that grade 6 example back on for Gary to chat about it, because this isn't a particular moment where you can immediately see the project level influence as part of the formative and summative experience. But what were the ways in which you started to imagine, Gary, the tasks that students were going to be engaging? And did you think about that through the lens of whether it's sort of a classical performance task type concept, whether you thought about it as a project or a PBL? How were you oriented in terms of drafting that in the storyboards?
Right. It really depended on the grade level of the students. And so with my 5th and 6th graders, it's really creating a fence for the problem for them to work within. And so the general problem in 6th grade is, as a research and design engineer, how can you work with your client to build the best phone stand possible? And so, that project gets taken in a lot of different directions. Where with my 7th and 8th graders in the storyboards, it's more reflected as one of the units is called What's Your Problem? And so this is where the students have a lot of choice over, both the fence of the problem that they're creating and the techniques, tools, processes that they'll use to solve it. And I think moving forward, one of the things that I would like to do with the storyboards is, in one of my classes, a big emphasis that we've had at ASH over the last couple of years is providing more student voice and agency. And one of the ways that we could do this is by structuring the storyboards so that the students can see not only the progression, but what choices that they might have. So for example, in my designing solutions class, rather than, all students working on the same problem at the same time, maybe we can use the storyboards to help leverage so that some students are working on one problem, another group on another, and say a third group on another. So, I think there's a higher ceiling to the storyboards also than what we're leveraging right now.
Thank you, Gary, for starting that off. Others at the table right now, Michelle, Angie, and Corey, how did assessment design connect with your curriculum storyboard draft? How did you see the connection?
Well, for me, go ahead, Angie.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think particularly because they were new courses and because we had the time to work on these together initially, the value is just sitting down, and having those conversations, because I think at the development stage, when you're talking about what's in a unit, like talking about the assessment that goes along with it just kind of feels natural. And, as we looked at different topics and how they spanned across the different years of the course, like from integrated 1 to 2 to 3, having conversations about what are the differences between those at the different levels, and like how are we looking at what the assessment might be or what it looks like.
For me,
I think one of the things I want to summarize for people that are just joining the conversation now is that in this 9th grade integrated math experience, because it was a brand new course moving away from a traditional Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2 to this integrated experience, the opportunity to actually look at it with fresh eyes and begin to think about what are the connections or through lines? In what ways is this relevant? So I think as Angie started to clarify it, that it's not only starting to think about the images that are illustrating an area of relevance, but also the kinds of problems and challenges that will be within that unit that not only help them build fluency in the core content, but also moving into that deeper conceptual understanding and transfer. So Michelle?
Yeah, I was going to say that for me, the first couple of units are really foundational skills for the rest of the course. And so in those units, I really had to kind of set the groundwork for everything else students were going to have to be able to do to be successful in the rest of the class. And so lots of those skills are foundational, and they're things that I constantly am assessing. And so those skills are formatively assessed pretty much on a daily basis. And then as we dig deeper into the chemistry units and the cookie category unit, that is more of where the summative work comes in, because students are using those foundational skills and building upon them and really strengthening their knowledge in terms of the baking process, in terms of how the science of baking works and how ingredients function together. They're writing recipes, they're baking things, and that summative assessment becomes much more clear, and they have to pass through the formative assessments in order to be successful, in order to get there.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I appreciate with the draft that you have, Michelle, is that the back half of the focus of the story starts to lean into that type of application. So as you can start to see in the chemistry of cookies, that they'll start to see what kinds of things are they on the hook for doing. So they're not only playing with precise measurements, but they learn how to troubleshoot. And so as a student, it gives me not only an area of interest in terms of cookies and chemistry hanging out together, but also beginning to start thinking about it like like a chemist and really starting to fine tune what the flavor profiles look like, texture, color, etc. So I also love the connection between Michelle and Gary in that way, because you can actually engineer a better cookie. So another question that came in was about the connection on curricular storyboards that actually bridge math and ELA, or science and social studies. So Kili, can you talk a little bit about that, around what the intentions are to continue to push to cross-curricular storyboards?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't think of any examples right offhand on the spot where we have existing storyboards for any interdisciplinary courses. You'll have to stay tuned. We've got some interdisciplinary courses being developed, and one of my starting points with teachers and teams is to support them in the development of new courses. For existing courses where I'm going about it in a more, let's say, planned route. And when I have opportunities to work with departments and teams in vertical meetings around formal curriculum review, that's when I'll go and support some of the work on the courses that have been around for a lot longer and that we want to develop curriculum storyboards for. But for the interdisciplinary units, we don't have any examples yet. That story continues. It's still in development.
Right. Yeah. And so, I mean, I think it's also really helpful to start to see what the strategy was initially as to where's the easiest on-ramp for curriculum storyboards. So again, I think the idea of curriculum review and brand new courses, or a change in how much time a course is, continues to create an impetus for that level of design, and then potentially extend it out from there. Another interesting piece is that you can do this as a subject area team. Again, Gary, I'm imagining as a subject area lead, you're also perhaps the teacher as well. So the opportunity to start looking at it across grade level bands, grade 5, 6, 7, and 8, as we just reviewed, as another important way to go, so that we're not necessarily designing one course at a time, but we have our eye toward how are we growing students' capacity across multiple grades. That's similar to what Michelle was doing as she started to lay out the foundations for her survey course in middle school in relationship to a course that they were taking in high school, as well as what you saw in math in terms of looking at moving from a classical structure to an integrated structure. And it's the opportunity not just to imagine those courses, but to, again, imagine the courses in sequence, so that we are doing things that are appropriate developmentally, but we're also doing things that continue to ask that perennial question: why do I have to learn this? Why is it important? How is it connected to my world? The more we can actually step back and begin to answer those questions through the design of the curriculum storyboard, we're not trying to justify anything. We're trying to clarify the territory in which kids can very much explore. So we have another question that's coming in from Michelle. Will these accompany the traditional detailed units like an atlas, or will they replace them? So I'm not sure what your intentions are. So whether it's a clarification on that one.
Yeah, so we're what I'm thinking at the moment is the technical platform change that I was referring was our learning management system, and that's the platform where we have all of our day-to-day support for instruction. So the formative assessments, the learning plan, the if you miss a day, how do you find what you've missed? It can also be the place where this work is submitted and tied to rubrics, and in some cases, and eventually down the road, also tied to our standards. So the learning, just a small point that I was thinking about as my colleagues were sharing their design process and starting with the learning goals. Our learning goals are coming from standards. They're coming from the school's adopted standards, which in most cases are the Common Core or the Arrow standards. And in the case of our design courses, we have design standards that we align to. And so while they were paraphrased and handwritten, kind of typed in on the storyboards, that was to make them more accessible for students and parents. Internally, we know that those are tied back to our learning standards that are, a published, externally validated set of standards. So will we replace more detailed plans? What we'll do is our learning management system has the very detailed, it becoming more detailed, because that was also some of the big lift this year for teachers, was to document their learning plans in our learning management system. And while that's not a scope and a sequence, it does provide a lot of structure and detail on what happens in the course, including a description, an overview, a syllabus, an outline of the assessments, the standards, and as I said, eventually where we will be able to track student progress and achievement against the standards. So that's going to be a piece of our curriculum documentation. The storyboards are an important piece of our documentation because that is where, Allison, you mentioned this bird's eye view of what's happening in the course. And then there's at least one additional component to our documentation, and that's zooming out even to a higher level, looking at our K-12, or we have preschool, pre-K as well, pre-kindergarten. So it'll be a pre-K to 12 scope and sequence document that we're also creating in Google Docs, as a Google Doc, that lays out unit titles and a very brief description of what the focus is. And that's where we also include, at the moment, the code for the standard. And then we can see from pre-K to 12 across a content area, math, social studies, literacy, language arts, art and design, we can see that scope and sequence. So it's really at the moment 3 levels: the scope and sequence document, the storyboards, and our learning management system components.
It's an interesting question that was raised, in that the curriculum storyboards are helpful to, again, lay out and make the language accessible and approachable and interesting. But at the same time, oftentimes teachers need a next level of detail from a planning point of view. So that's the rub of trying to figure out, what does that template look like? And starting to make sure that the template is something that is not a bureaucratic exercise, that it's something that teachers actually value as a planning tool. And some of the classical templates may need a second look to be a little bit more streamlined, regardless of whether they're warehoused on Atlas or they're on Toddle or even in a Google Doc. But I think the other point that I want to echo is, as Kili's starting to describe, of looking at this through different lenses or layers, because it's incredibly powerful to start to see, what does it look like from, if I'm wanting to be in high school and I'm looking at the English program, can I actually visualize what it looks like in 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, and in the elective sequence, typically that shows up in 12th grade? And then begin to start thinking about, how can I make strategic choices as a student who wants to potentially enroll in classes? So these are starting to be the ways that we're seeing curriculum storyboards be implemented, where students are asking them to actually be directly connected to the course of studies, or the opportunity of starting to have teachers begin to use that with students to actually drive the student teacher parent led conversations, so that when families can see the storyboards and students can speak to some of the insights and the artifacts that they experienced along the way, it is a nice natural bridge between that conversation. And I think the last and most important piece is that when we're trying to get families to better understand the scope of the year so far, this is something that is very different than a syllabus, because it is accessible and inviting, so that parents can actually hold on to that, whether people these days put things on their refrigerator or they just keep a virtual copy. It is an opportunity for them to continue to stay in the loop of what their students are engaging with. So as we wind down, anybody that wants to say a last word. So the last word would be, where are you heading to next based on your initial drafting of the curriculum storyboards? So an idea or a next step. So open to anyone. So.
Well, maybe I can kick us off with where some ideas that really just, Allison, through the conversations that I've been so fortunate to have had recently with you and with others who are engaging with storyboards. I love how you're really pushing my thinking around, the student voice to like even next level. Like, where can students be put even more actively into the role of writers of their own stories? And how does that look in what we're doing already? I think that I've been really just so grateful for the work with our math department, for Angie and for Corey, for first of all coming and joining the conversation today, but also for leading the work in the department to take this new approach on board. So I'm next step, eager to go back to the math department and reflect on that experience. How might we reflect on what it is to make it even more accessible to students? What does that look like? What changes in modifications might we be making now already as we move forward? And then I think the example that Gary and Michelle have given me is just, inspiration for that. It is an accessible approach for some people. And I love that they jumped on with very little, what felt like to me, very little support, and how excited they were to try it out and the kind of guidance that it provided them. So I'm really excited to see where that could go after conversations like this create a shared experience for us also at ASH around, ways that we could be thinking differently about student voice. I think we've been thinking about it in one way, but have we also been thinking about it through the lens of students as authors of their own learning stories, and how might storyboarding be a springboard for that possibility as well? So those are a couple of things that I've been thinking about more recently, knowing that I still have a lot of work ahead with, in general, with bringing the storyboards to we're really as a school just starting on this journey. So I want to make that pretty clear to people listening in. We by no means have it figured out, but I'm really grateful for the teachers joining me today and sharing what they've taken.
I think, Kili, it's so important that you're starting to think about student agency and student voice. And really, there are two major territories for how to accomplish that. First and foremost, as you started to suggest, students can actually be the authors of their own curriculum story. So leaning into something that Gary said a little bit ago, that opportunity that they're seeing more and more choices, where sort of like the training wheels are being released, as you said, Carrie, from 5th grade to 6th grade to 7th grade to 8th grade, so that now that they have the structure, the parameters of the design thinking process, they can actually be a little bit now more open to exploring problems that matter to them. But I think the other interesting piece, in addition to having students actually design their own curriculum stories, they actually can navigate an existing story that teachers are drafting on their behalf. in other words, the students can actually have spaces to reflect, spaces where they actually are archiving samples of their own work to tell that story of their own successes in connection to the learning goals or learning targets that were specified. So that's another way of continuing to get students to be having agency in that story, because they are self-assessors and self-evaluators, and they can set goals for themselves based on the goals that the teacher already started to lay out. So those, to me, as we start to wind down, really helpful to keep in mind. More student agency can still very much be grounded in the foundational content and concepts that are part of many course curriculum. So anyone else that wants to have a last word on where you're heading to next, what you're excited about?
In terms of the design process, one thing that I'll do at the end of the year is gather around to feedback from the students themselves on the documents. Since, you know, I was the creator, but they're the audience. And so using that feedback, then make modifications for next year to make it more accessible to the students.
Absolutely. I think it's so important that if you're writing for the students as audience, it's lovely for them to give you feedback on your work. So, because it's directly written for them. So, well, thank you so much for enjoying this conversation together. I know it's at the end of the day for you all, so I appreciate you taking the time and looking forward to the next conversation. And if you want more information, you can hop on to curriculumstoryboards.com. I know there have been a fair number of questions about looking at concrete examples. There are examples that are not only in this video, those can be shared, but at the same time, there are more examples on the website as more people are starting to onboard and draft their own curriculum stories. So thank you again, Kili and Michelle and Angie and Corey and Gary. Looking forward to next time.